Welcome to Unsolicited Book Reviews with Michael David MacBride. That's me. Typically, this is a collection of reviews that I've done, but I'm doing some of these special episodes with friends of mine. And in this case, I'm joined by Mike Lee, who is a musician, and he performs as Six Strings and a Mic. You can go to his website, sixstringsandamike.com, and you can find out where he's performing. You can also pick up a copy of his latest CD, which is wonderful. I love my copy. Mike signed for me. And he often performs at bars and wineries and breweries and things like that in southeastern Michigan. So the tour part of his webpage will help you out there. I asked Mike what book he wanted to talk about, and he chose Gang Leader for a Day by Sudhir Venkatesh. And it should be a good conversation. Ready? Let's go. Well, thanks for joining me with Unsolicited Book Reviews. Today I'm joined by my friend Michael Lee, who is one of, I think we decided like 9 Mikes or Michaels from our class at Celine. And it's actually honestly one of the best things that's come out of social media for me. One is their memories feature, and then 2 is reconnecting with people like Mike. We were casual acquaintances, friendly in the past, but really kind of reconnected over the last couple of years, and last year maybe even. But welcome. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Yeah. And I look forward to chatting. Today, what I did, we were just kind of talking about this podcast thing, and I love talking about books, and you seem to be a pretty avid reader these days. I don't know if you always were, if that's newer, but when I approached you about reading a book, you had mentioned potentially doing this one, Gang
Yep.
Leader for a Day by
There it is. That's right.
Sudhir Venkatesh.
Sudhir Venkatesh. Yeah,
Yeah, I did the audiobook, which is why mine is paper.
sounds
Um,
good. Right
and
on.
I'm kind of curious, I guess first of all, how did you come across this book? Because that's one of the things for me. Like sometimes I forget where I even heard about a book in the first place, but where
Yeah,
did you
for
hear
sure.
about it for the first time?
Yeah, so I guess I'll rewind a little bit. So you asked if I was always a reader. I was not always a reader. I could never get into fiction, and I thought that's all there was until I was well into my mid to late 20s, probably. And I had a pastor who was an avid reader. So from there, that inspired me to really get into a lot of reading. So I gravitate toward nonfictional theology, obviously. Well, would you yeah, it's obviously nonfiction if it's theology, but you get the idea. I prefer nonfiction, and I prefer the subcategory of theology. However, if I'm going to read a book that's not theology, I have a hard time getting into fiction. I read a couple here and there, but if I'm going to read another book that's not theology, I like nonfiction still. Well, I'm a substitute teacher in primarily middle schools, and I was in the lunchroom one day, in the teacher's lounge lunchroom, and they have a used bookshelf that's in there. Just have a book, take a book, leave a book, need a book, that kind of thing. And I was just scrolling through it, and I saw it sitting there, and I said, you know what, that sounds kind of interesting. And I thought it was fiction at first, and then I started reading the back cover and the dust jacket and all that, and I saw that it was a true story. So I'm like, oh yeah, I like that. Then I saw that it was based on um, social research, and I thought it'd be fantastic just to peruse while I was teaching classes.
Yeah, and I love stories like that. Often the books that I come across are in a similar situation. I'll be bored, I'll be sitting around, maybe I'll be visiting someone's house, I'll see their bookshelf, I'll ask them questions about what they're reading
Hmm.
or why.
Yep,
And it's kind of fun how sometimes books just kind of call to you in some weird way like that. So
for sure.
um this one was not one that I had heard about. And it's interesting because when I looked more into Sadir's background, I realized he actually spent a fair amount of time on different podcasts that I listened to, like
Mm,
Freakonomics. And he was often on like some of the NPR podcasts that I enjoyed listening to. I probably heard him in passing, but somehow I never connected that he wrote
interesting.
books. So I was delighted to then be reminded of that connection when you suggested this book. And it is really a I don't know. It was interesting listening to the audiobook. He did not read it, first of all. It was
Yeah,
read
not until the
by,
last chapter, I think it was. Yeah.
yeah, and the last chapter is like this interesting interview with, I think, the publisher. Asks him a number of different questions. Is that in the print book as well?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
That's all there. Yep.
Yeah, I kind of like how, I mean, one of the questions I think that hit me in there was you're a researcher and you've written about these stories, in your research and for your dissertation. Why did you choose to essentially write about it in this kind of memoir format? Because for anybody who hasn't read it, I mean, it's written in the first person. Sudhir is literally immersing himself in kind of gangland community in Chicago and spending time with people in gangs and just writing about those experiences. And it was kind of an interesting question to think about. Was like, you wrote about this way. Why did you want to write about it again, almost 10 years after he had done the research? And ultimately, I think his answer was like, I thought more people would benefit from hearing the story. So, but
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. So I'm curious, having read it then, what caused you to choose it for us? Why did you think you and I should chat about it?
Well, literally, I think it was that afternoon was the day that I picked it up. And then I think you reached out to me the next day. Hey, I've got this idea of doing these book reviews. And just because selfish timekeeping, I guess. It was there, and I was already a few chapters into it because it's a pretty quick read. I'm like, hey, how about this book? And that's literally the only reason. And I wouldn't have recommended a fiction probably most, so I
Yeah.
figured it made sense.
Yeah, it was a pretty easy read, like you said. I mean, I don't know how many pages is in print, but kind of based on how long it was in audiobook, I'm guessing 288, 290 pages, something like that, probably.
That's pretty
Uh,
good. 290, 290.
okay. I start
Yeah.
getting a pretty good ear for how long a book is in audio versus the
Good.
actual print version. And a lot of times I'll go back and I'll look at the print version too, because the print, has images or graphs or whatever
Mm,
that sometimes are attachments in an audiobook, but it's hard to see them out of context.
yeah,
But
right.
um, but I'm curious, like, what kind of thoughts do you have about it? And I'll say kind of selfishly because of your background in law enforcement, I'm curious, like, that perspective on the story, because I imagine you probably encountered, um, I mean, you weren't in Chicago, but
Right.
you probably encountered some moments that were challenging, like Sudhir is writing about.
Yeah, for sure. So, for those who are maybe uh, potentially interested, Sudhir was in grad school looking at doing a social dissertation in his social sciences field. And he wanted to support previous research, and he decided that he would take these previous questions that had been asked by previous researchers and take them into the projects, the ghetto in Chicago, and ask these questions. And when he got there, he was met with this, man, you can't just come in here and ask questions and expect us to answer these questions for some stranger coming in from the outside. It just doesn't work that way. So he decides to live amongst them basically for several years. Well, it, in my experience, and now I'm not going to claim that that I was the greatest police officer in the world, but I did see some of these same themes emerge. In that one of them is this issue of how to gain somebody's respect in the real world, and a couple notions come to mind. One of them was that especially with men and men in the Black community, even more specifically, if I had to arrest a man of the household or the man of the car, I would often ask them to step away from their children and arrest them behind their car so that their kids didn't see them getting put in handcuffs, just as a respect issue. And that went a long, long way with people in that situation. Another one was in the Arabic community when I was doing an investigation and I had to talk to the wife. Well, if you're familiar at all with anybody in the Muslim religion, then you have to go through the man or the tribal leader in order to speak to any of the women in the clan. I think they call it a clan. So I went and I had to talk to the woman who was a witness to something, and she said, "Well, you're going to have to wait until my husband gets home." So she calls her husband, and I literally stood outside the door. Thankfully, it was a nice day, and he comes in and he says, "Yes, come on in." So I walk in, and he says, "Please take off your boots." And I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't do that. But in their community, that was a big sign of earning and giving trust, is that you take off their boots and you eat their food. So literally, here I am. I'm like, well, I'm going to take a chance on it. I took off my boots. I go in, they feed me, and we're talking. And she talks to me because her husband is sitting right there. And it was a measure of respect in that community. So I share those two stories because here Sudhir wanted to go in and with this litany of questions, fill in the blank kind of thing, and they're like, you can't just do that. So he learns that if I become one of them and hang out with them, then they'll accept me and I'll learn these answers. But throughout the book, you find out that this kind of had some backfiring to it as well.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that was such a good point. I'm glad you brought back those questions because that was one of the funniest moments because it is that like meeting of academia and then like reality and like that gap in there. Absolutely. He comes in with his list of questions and he's like, how does it feel to be black and poor in America? And they're
Yeah.
like, what the hell, dude? Like, what do you,
Yeah.
you can't just come in asking questions like that. And like, that was only one of the questions that he was asking them that were like outright offensive and,
Yeah, right.
really didn't get at the heart of the matter. And he kind of, throughout the book, you kind of spiral back to some of those questions and you see how he ends up learning a way to kind of get at what those questions were trying to get at in a much more subtle way. And for me, it was almost like a kind of an anthropological kind of perspective where the anthropologist like sits in the community and they observe, and they're not supposed to interfere. And for the most part, Sudhir does try to stay out of it, but there are a couple times where he can't help but help somebody, or there are a couple times where he actually gets involved in the violence as well. And it's interesting to be a researcher and supposed to be objective, but then at a certain point you get connected with these people as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm.
So yeah, I
Which
thought
does that have a biasing effect? And I guess, but as we go on, this is probably going to be more than simply a review of a book, but it will also probably be um, how does this mesh with real world and how we do things? So as you bring that up, I say this of, does that have a biasing effect on him that when he writes it, now he's maybe looking more favorably upon this group of people that he wouldn't normally hang out with, rather than as an outsider. Now he's an insider, and now he might skew things the other way. Whereas a black and white research only might be shaded a different way. So I thought that was
yeah.
kind of an interesting aspect of it.
And his background is interesting too. I mean, Sudhir was born in India and then moved and then raised in a fairly affluent area in California. And,
Mm-hmm.
so then when he goes to Chicago projects, what was it? Robert Taylor projects, they're not sure what to make of him. They think he's a Latino from a rival gang initially when he shows up. And they're challenging him like, show us your, they keep saying Mexican instead of Spanish, and
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
and they're
He's not
like
even
trying,
close.
they're trying to shake him loose and figure out who this guy is. And I do think, that definitely works to his favor that he's an anomaly, that they're like, I don't know who this guy is, but he doesn't seem threatening. He's maybe, he's from school, and the more you learn about some of the gang members like JT and oh gosh, I can't remember the other guy's name, but two of them have college backgrounds, that
Mm-hmm.
had taken classes at least or completed degrees and then, went back to running gangs and participating in that. And
Yep.
so I think there was kind of curiosity on both sides initially. And then you're right. At a certain point, those kind of cross over, and I do wonder, if that kind of colors his perspective and analysis at the end of the day.
Hmm.
Because I do think it's hard to be objective of people that you care about.
Yeah.
Um, but
And I wonder if could a white male researcher go in and do this exact same thing? Did he have an advantage because he was East Indian now going into a black culture, whereas a white guy like myself, they might think, well, you're part of our problem in the first place, either real or perceived. Um, would somebody else be able to do that? Would a female be able to do that? Or would she only have the female's perspective, the prostitutes and all that that he refers to in here. So it's kind of
yeah,
interesting.
I agree. I mean, I think the happy accident of, just him being who he was and where he was from, and just naive enough to think that he can go and just ask questions um, and just kind of fit in was part of the charm and what made it work for him. And
Mm-hmm.
later in the book, initially he really spends time with the men, but he does end up, like you said, start talking to the prostitutes and also the women who kind of run the scenes behind the like run the apartments and like get repairs done and a lot of these other kind of side businesses.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, and he's able to, for lack of a better word, infiltrate that part of the world. But it's probably not as easy for him to get into that communication with the women as it would be if it was a female investigator or researcher, I
Yeah,
should
for
say.
sure. For sure.
Um, but yeah, it's interesting. So, what other things jumped out at you that that you thought were worth mentioning?
Something else that jumped out was this overall distrust of the police that led to their own kind of quasi police force inside their neighborhood.
Yeah.
So early on in the book, he kept calling this area the projects, and one of I think it was one of the women that he was talking to, one of the leaders of this uh, um, community. She says, "This ain't the projects, honey. This is a community." No, I think it was JT's mom
Okay.
in this conversation when he was invited over for eating meals over there. And she says, "Look, one thing you have to understand is that this isn't, we don't see this as um, anything other than a community because we're all in here in the same situation trying to help each other. This person has this resource that I need, and I have this resource that this other person needs." And so that going into this notion that the police were their enemies, granted, I didn't police in the 80s, so I don't know what it was like, and I can't imagine on both sides what it was like. Um, but for their overall distrust of police, it saddens me because I would like to think that I was a pretty trustworthy police officer, that people could come to me. But yet again, I'm coming from another perspective that somebody else says, look, we've been beat up or we've been mother effed or we've been disrespected from our families. Why would I come to you with anything? So therefore they police themselves of sorts, and so they kind of relied on the gang to enforce a level of protection for their own people. um, uh, Prostitutes may have had to pay a tax, or certain people who were squatting in an apartment would have to pay a tax. But then it was up to this gang to enforce who could stay and squat or who was causing more trouble and bringing in pressure from the outside from police forces. Therefore, they had their own thing, and they either accepted or rejected certain people. I found that truly fascinating because in my world, that doesn't happen that way. My block doesn't have anything like that. We call 911. I can't imagine what it's like not to have that confidence to be able to call 911.
Yeah, and Sudhir mentions that a number of times where he's like, call an ambulance. And they're like, the ambulance doesn't come here. Like, that's
Yeah.
just not a thing. And he's so dubious of that. And, because like you said, I mean, he was raised, in a predominantly affluent part of California where you called the ambulance and it was there and it came quickly. And,
Hmm.
and that's just, a basic service, let alone, calling somebody in for a domestic dispute or any number of other horrible things that police officers have to do, in addition to just kind of the more mundane things as well. Like that is, um, it's just not part of their world. And you're right. Then they've built this system, and as the book goes on, you learn like the gang, not only polices and protects and, provides, I guess, basic medical attention
Yeah, right,
and
right,
transportation. And then, they also get the vote out, to like get people registered to vote at one point as well. And that is tainted by telling them who to vote for, and which
right.
community leader will do the things that they want them to do. And but it is really interesting. Like they have this like whole sub layer. So there's the community, and then there's like the gang, and then there's almost like the outside world underneath that. And I
Hmm.
really enjoyed reading. I mean, it made me sad, but it was also really interesting to learn. I guess growing up in the 80s and 90s, hearing about gangs, it was always negative. And I'm not saying this was a good thing, but they found a way to provide good services in addition to the drugs and violence as well.
Yeah. I have long been fascinated in the history and the subculture of the mafia, the Italian mafia and Sicilian mafia in New York, Chicago, wherever it happened to be at the time in the heyday, the 60s through the 80s, right? And I've read several of the books, watched a cajillion documentaries just because it was interesting. But the exact same thing happened here as it did there, in this book, in this black community compared to the Italian community. The exact same things happen, except for the painting of the picture in the background is significantly different. Over here on the mafia side, it's glamorous. People wanted to do that because it was powerful. Over here on the black community, they did it out of necessity, out of protection. It wasn't nearly as glamorous. Um, the mafia is painted in movies as, they're the good fellas. They are the guys who are the heroes of the streets. Sadly, the black and Mexican gangs, Latin gangs, whatever, um, even the skinhead gangs, they are the villains of the communities, right? But one thing that emerged in the book that I thought was interesting is that the two operated similarly in structure. And in the mafia, they said when we ran a certain block or neighborhood or something like that, our women and our children could go from point A to point B safely without fear of getting hurt, without getting harassed, things like that, because we provided their protection. And I think that's the same thing that Sudhir was getting at here, is that kind of protection was afforded for their people. If you stayed in our community, we were your helpers. You go outside of it, there's nothing we can do to help you. And while there was the criminal subculture going on, I did find that was an evidence of God's grace, I guess you could say, that these people were offering to help each other, unfortunately through illegal means, whether mafia or a black gang, etc., but that they were offering help and respite for their own people.
Yeah. And it's so they end up forming such a close bond that even, and this is, I can't remember if this was at the end of the book or in the little after chapter, but Sudhir says that after they tear down Robert Taylor and it's kind of dispersed and like they're going to make something else of that, several of the members in the community, large groups of them, move to live in the same place. Like there's like 10 or 15 families that stick together in different pockets of Chicago once they're displaced. Like they form that tight connection. Um, so calling it the community, it was very accurate, so much
Mm-hmm.
so that they were committed to then sticking with people. I like that idea. I hadn't I guess I should have made the obvious connection to the mob because you're right. I mean, it's the same kind of hierarchical structure of like a mob boss at the very top, and then it's kind of trickles down, and you have the um, you know the uh, people on the street, literally enforcing and that kind of stuff, but providing other services as well. And your point's a really good one there. I mean, the mob is often depicted as favorable, or it's at least um,
Glamorized.
glamorized. Yeah, I think that's fair. And I don't know that any of the depiction of the gangland activities have been glamorized. Not that they should be, but
Right,
I
right.
also do wonder why the mob has been chosen to be more glamorized like that. It'd
Mhm.
be interesting to see a more perhaps brutal, realistic version of that as well. But
Right. And
yeah.
this probably is why so many young kids um, are indoctrinated into it. Just like it happened in the mafia, they started raising them up from young ages, being messengers and servants, and helping with different things. I think the same is probably true here, and even in the black games when they say, well, it, from their perspective, well, if the police are against us, the only people I have on my side are these guys that provide for us and protect for us, and they happen to be gangsters. I want to be like them, and right, wrong, or indifferent, and they choose the same lifestyle. Sadly, either mafia or any other gangland uh, winds up either in an early grave or in prison, but very few get out alive, unfortunately. But
And I think you
um,
just don't see alternatives, or if you don't have examples of alternative lifestyles. I mean, I know for a very basic level, like when I went to college, I didn't think about there are careers that people have that I have no idea how they found them. Like there wasn't a major. So like, how did you find this job? If I had somebody in my family who had that job, I would have known that was a possibility. And that's a very basic kind of thing. But like, growing up, the people around you definitely influence what you see as
for
possible.
sure.
My kids will grow up knowing that you can write books. Like, yeah, you should be able to write a book if you want to. You can go to college. You can do all of these different things. But if I was a different person, they wouldn't see those as options or
Right.
possibilities. So um, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what the answer is to that. I mean, there you do get kind of towards the end of the book, the community activists who try to go into the community and offer alternatives, and engage the youth, especially in games and just kind of community engagement kind of things to show them alternatives. I don't know if that's I don't really get a strong sense of whether that works in the book, really. Like
Yeah.
Sudhir spends time there, but he's kind of told, like, hey, dude, you got to pick who you're with. Are you with me? Or are you with them? And Sudhir is
Hmm.
ultimately like, well, this is really my research, and I guess I'm committed to you. So that's the path he
Right.
chooses.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there, going on that, there was the point in the book where he got so ingrained when he started learning of illegal activity being planned, and he went to his research, what professor, whoever, I don't know how it works in the doctoral world, but he goes to this professor and he says, hey, I think you really need to start consulting an attorney because now you have you're a witness to something and you can be called to witness. And when you brought up, are you with us or are you with them? And this was a conversation that Sudhir had with one of the women. I think it was JT's mom again. Um, Look, if if you're going to give up all of this information that you put in here with names and dates and places on it, you're not with us. And I think he was endeared to them, or they endeared themselves to him, however that works, right? And because of that, I think he felt this pull of I I can't give these people up, because one time he did start sharing some information just within the gang, within the
Yes.
community, and it backfired on him, and suddenly everybody pulls away from him. And I honestly don't think he wanted that to happen again and on a larger scale, and now have to go in and testify against the very people he said that he was there to learn about, giving them the reason to say, see, you were just like one of them. You only came in to sell us out. And
Yeah,
what a tough and a dangerous position to be in, all for the sake of research. So I would imagine his research is probably still going on in that vein, um, because he changed names. I looked up the gang, and I'm like, I've never heard of the Black Kings, and
me too.
I think I know the gang he's referring to. But he said names, places, people, which is typical in an unauthorized biography, right?
Yeah,
Um, because they didn't say, yeah, go ahead and use my name in this illegal activity. So he changes all of it, but makes it pretty close. All we know is Chicago is really it. I don't even know if Robert Taylor was truly the name of the
sure.
project's community. So I would imagine because of that, he's protecting them, he's protecting himself, so that he can continue this. And what is the end game? Is there any solution for it?
I
I'm
don't know.
skeptical, but I don't know.
Yeah. What one of my very favorite moments you alluded to, where he gets so familiar with the gang that everybody just kind of starts talking to him. And so then he's obsessed with trying to figure out the finances of the gang. Like how
Yeah,
much money do they make and how much money, does this person make and that person and whatever. And so he starts asking them. And then he quickly learns that a lot of the people lower on the totem pole have side gigs. They're like, well, I do this and I get, $12 here, and I do that and I get $6 and I do. And so he starts acquiring all this stuff, and he's proud of this information that he's learned. And like you said, he goes back to JT, and JT is like, hey, I've been talking to a lot of people. What kind of stuff are you finding out? And he tells them. And then it completely backfires on him because JT goes back and is like, you're holding out on me, and you're doing this and you're doing that. And like, then nobody wants to talk to him. And I think
right.
you're right. I mean, that was really hard for him because he felt connected to those people and, beyond the trust, like also just kind of, I don't know, enjoyed them as human beings and, realized he had betrayed them in a way that he didn't think was possible. And that was, like you said, somebody inside the gang, let alone somebody from the outside world. So that must have been a really hard decision to then publish. And, I guess the other part early in the book is JT is actually kind of proud that somebody wants to write about him because the way Sudhir originally
Yeah,
brings it up, he's like, well, it's going to be kind of your biography. And like JT's like, all right, that's cool. Like I
yeah.
like this idea of my story being told.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. And that question about how unbiased your perspective can be once you're that connected is hard. Um, and like you said, I don't know ultimately what the end game of this is. And I think Sudhir would probably say, my job is to report. My job is to give you this information about what the community looks like and how it operates so that we can understand it better. But I don't know that his job is to find an answer. I think he would say, like, I've reported it. Now it's for somebody in city planning or in law enforcement or in the community engagement to figure this out. And
Yeah.
um, uh, anything else that jumped out at you that you wanted to chat about? Or
Um, let's see what do I have here on my personal notes here. Oh, I did make this observation. Well, at least I don't know if it's an observation or things to consider. Is that it seems like a book like this draws up four different perspectives. There's the gang from the gang's perspective. There's the gang from the police perspective. There's the police from the gang's perspective, and then the police from the police's perspective. Um, I have a good insight on police from the police perspective for the most part. Um, in our culture today, there's a whole lot of negativity about police work, and some of that is brought about by just bad cops being bad cops. And there are The first people that want bad cops out of police work are the good cops. We don't like bad cops because it
Sure.
ruins what good cops are trying to do. So from that vantage point, I see the inside of police work from police perspective. I never once in my entire career in 25 years ever woke up saying, you know, I hope I get to kill somebody today. I hope I get to beat up a man today. I hope I get to falsely accuse somebody today. Not ever once did I have that. Are there people like that? There probably are, but it's not nearly as big as modern media wants to play it out to be. And sadly, that causes this clash that a clash that further divides, I think, prohibiting people from one culture from talking with another culture. I went to a crime scene one time, and it was in a projects area, and it was getting pretty well wrapped up. We were just about done with it, and there was a group of people sitting off to the side just watching. They weren't causing any problem. They were just drinking some beer and watching what the police do. And I was tired. I was sitting, standing up on my feet. It was hot all day, so I went over and I sat with them, and we got to talking. And this one guy says, "Hey, man, you want a beer?" And I'm like, well, I'm in uniform. I can't exactly do that. He says, well, you come on over afterwards and you have a beer with us. I never did that, but um, as we got to talking, they were asking me questions about how we do things. I was asking them questions about life in their community, and both of us almost simultaneously said, you know what? The media says this isn't allowed to happen. A white cop sitting with a group of black guys in the hood talking about life and our differences, yet our similarities. So when I read this book, I thought, man, I'm on this police from police perspectives. JT has the gangs from the gangs perspective. He's an expert on that. In the middle, you have the gangs from the police perspective. There's probably some right and wrong views. And then you have the police from the gangs perspective, some right and wrong views that are meshing in there. But sadly, I don't think the media wants cultures, different people groups, really to mesh well together. Because if they can divide us, then they can further different political agendas, I think, easier in their minds rather than a united people coming together in a strong way in a country.
It definitely doesn't sell as many papers or news stories for sure. I mean, I think that's the definitely an unfortunate part of like the 24-hour news cycle is always needing something that is spectacular or novel. And the problem with it always being on then is it feels like that's the everyday and not the novel or the,
Mm-hmm.
the anomaly. It is the assumption is this always happens when, it is the 1 in 100th time that something happens, or it's the rare instance instead. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, do you think a book like this helps though? Like I'm kind of like I was thinking through. I mean, to me, it was eye-opening to like think about the different ways a gang functions in a city and the services it provides, and it was interesting for sure. But I was trying to think of like to your point, like the solution. Is there a solution and what that is? I don't know that it necessarily points to one. So I was kind of curious, like, I don't know. I mean, to get to your point of the drastically different perspectives, does this offer some middle point or perform a function that's useful?
I think it does in the sense that if we look at the divide of sorts as being a gigantic cinder block wall, maybe books like this just take out a block or two and allow us to peer over or into the hole to see the other side's perspective. Um, I don't know of any police perspective books. Maybe it's out of pride or arrogance that police haven't written something like this, but to reveal uh, to people who are not in the law enforcement or paramilitary community of what the world is like. Now, granted, I'm ignorant. There's probably books out there. I just haven't
Who
seen them
knows?
pushed.
Sure.
Maybe it's just not popular, or maybe they just feel like we have to be hush hush. But I think a book like this helps reveal, um, from one side to another, hey, here's at least a peek. Um, Even in all our differences, we are very similar, and we're all
Yeah.
trying to survive. We're all trying to help each other. And sadly, in my worldview, there's this thing called sin that just destroys everything and corrupts everything that we think and do and say. And sadly, that only causes us to build these walls that aren't helpful. So I think anything that can help us see another person's perspective is probably helpful.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think anytime you can see into a different, honestly, that's the thing I like about fiction, is it's really easy to get the internal thoughts of somebody other than you. It
Mm,
provides that lens into a world or a perspective. It's much harder to get the internal thoughts in nonfiction because unless you're writing it about yourself, you don't really know what they're thinking. So for me, that's the function fiction solves. But
mm,
nonfiction like this, I think, really does provide a glimpse. It provides empathy. Like these are living, breathing human beings trying to do the best they can in the circumstances they're in. And, it gives you that kind of understanding. I think too, one of the things, and I hadn't really thought about this until you were talking, but one of the things that works well in this book is Sudhir, I think, begins the book very much like I would assume most people, ignorant of and naive. And he goes into this place, and then as he goes along the book, gains empathy for who they are and their lifestyle and their perspective. And ultimately, the big thing, especially, and I can't remember what the woman's name is. It's not JT's mom, but it's the woman who like runs a lot of the project aspects of it. Anyway, she basically says like, you're not asking the right questions. The right
mm-hmm,
questions are how did we get here and what keeps us here kind of thing. And this is why. And, I think once you start getting to that point, you start maybe figuring out what some of those answers could be. Um,
mm-hmm.
but I guess I hadn't thought about that. I like how the book progresses. And, as you read it, you become hopefully more empathetic for their situation. And if nothing else, it gives you a lens. I like the little brick in the wall, like you said. So,
Yeah, for sure.
but well, I would like to say before we go, I mean, first of all, thanks so much for
Yeah,
joining us.
yeah,
Everybody
yeah.
out
It's
there,
fun.
gang leader oh, we didn't mention the title. So the title, gang leader for a
Oh,
day, comes from because by the time he actually gains
oh yeah.
JT's
How
trust,
do we forget that?
I don't know. Yeah, he actually gets to be a gang leader. Now, he doesn't he treads kind of thinly, right? He struggles at a couple
Yeah.
moments where he wants to he wants to
Exert some
regu-
authority or decision making. Yeah.
and then he also wants to like push it off on somebody else. And JT is like, no, this is your call. You got to do it. and
Yep.
um, and they drew lines. Like I'm not going to kill anybody. I'm not going to hit anybody. Like there are things that he wasn't going to do, but like the decision making process was all his. I expected the
Yep.
whole book to be that based on the title, and
I
so
did too.
I was a little disappointed. But then like when we finally got to it, I was like, oh, that's right. That's what it's called.
Yeah. And how a way that was fascinating to me was that this was kind of the pinnacle of the story. You're thinking, I could do that. How hard is it to be this? And then he realizes, man, if I make that decision, it has this ripple effect over here, and then I've got this to pay for. Forget about it. It's all yours. You can have it. And so yeah, that was fascinating that he was so ill-equipped to do
Yeah.
this, and yet it showed. um, I think a lot of it owes to JT's intellectual background. You had mentioned earlier that he was a college educated. I don't know if he graduated, but he was college educated, and but it shows how much thinking, right, wrong, or indifferent, but how much thinking and planning and anticipating the good or bad outcomes of a certain decision. It wasn't something taken lightly, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. It was really interesting to hear him kind of struggle with that because it's like this guy needs to be punished because he did something wrong. But the problem is he's a good producer. So if you take him out, then you're gonna reduce your bottom line. And the other thing that JT is super interesting about is he doesn't write stuff down. So he's got it like all in his head because he doesn't want to leave a paper trail behind. So, he's running these numbers and he knows all this stuff off the top of his head, which is just kind of incredible. But
Right.
um, anyway, um, you can find Mike at Six Strings in a Mic, MIKE.com. If you're in and around Michigan, you can check him out. He's got all kinds of shows already booked through 2024 at most bars and wineries. I know I loved seeing you when we were in town. And I'll also
Thanks, man.
add, if you're not in the area, you can still buy a copy of a CD, which I have here as
Ah,
well.
man, thanks,
Yeah,
bro.
absolutely. But
uh,
I would definitely recommend Gang
for
Leader
sure,
for a day,
for
Sudhir
sure.
Venkatesh. So thanks so much, Mike. I really appreciate you
Right on.
joining me.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. You can find out more about me at my webpage, michaelmacbride.com, or on most social media platforms with the same handle, at Michael MacBride. That's MacBride, like Mac and Bride. Let me know what you're listening to, or if you read one of these books, leave me a comment and let me know what you thought. Have a great day.